Okay, good morning. Today is psychedelic cookies. Today's topic is pretty intense, and I'm going to be approaching it from a philosophical approach, logical. Some of you, hmm, some of you in the atheist community might question my logic, but bear with me. I'm going to try to work through this. Anyway, welcome to my show, Saturday Morning Wake and Bake, and I'm Chuck McGuire. Today I'm going to be talking about God. So, God, the concept of God, the notion of God, most often arises in the form of a question. Do you believe in God? This is a very loaded question for many reasons. I'm going to touch on a couple of them real quick. For one, your answer can be used against you, regardless of what your answer is, because it is assumed to be a dichotomous question. It's either yes or no. If an atheist asks a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, do you believe in God? And they answer yes, the atheist can use that a, as a reason to be dismissive of you. Likewise, if a believing person asks an atheist, do you believe in God? And they say no, then likewise they can use that as a reason to dismiss that person. When I'm asked, do I believe in God? My answer to this question is both a qualified yes and a qualified no. If I am allowed to define God, then yes, I do believe in God. If you are allowed to define God, then maybe no, depending on your definition. If I'm allowed to believe in God, then it would be, if I'm allowed to define God, then my definition would be as follows. For discussion with most people, I would define God as the form of being, with an explanation of what a form is. It's referencing Plato, Socrates, Greek philosophy, with an explanation of what a form is and a clarification of the difference between existing and being, that is, to exist versus to be, and a clarification of the difference between create and make. that is, creator versus maker. For discussion with a fellow philosopher, I might add, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that technically it would be the form of form, which is a ridiculous paradox. So let's get started here. Switching over to Wikipedia that I've got set up here and ready to go. Okay, this is Wikipedia, the theory of forms, and we're going to jump down to I think it's this section, yeah. Form. Plato wrote about Socrates. Socrates didn't have any of his own writings. Socrates may or may not have been a fictitious character used to illustrate arguments. No one's really for certain of that. Maybe they are, I don't know. That doesn't matter. What matters is that out of Plato's writings of Socrates, we get the concept of forms. A form is the ideal of a thing, and I've got some examples here in the evidence of forms section here. It says Plato's main evidence for the existence of forms is intuitive only and is as follows. And this is an example because he didn't actually use blue jeans. We didn't have them. But we call both the sky and blue jeans by the same color, blue. However, clearly a pair of jeans and the sky are not the same color. Moreover, the wavelengths of light refracted by the sky at every location and all millions of blue jeans everywhere is fading constantly. Yet, we somehow have a consensus of the basic form blueness as it applies to them. The state of blue, what blue actually is. And Plato says, but if the very nature of knowledge changes, at the time when the change occurs, there will be no knowledge. And according to this view, there will be no one to know and nothing to be known. But if that which knows and that which is known exist ever, and the beauty and the good and every other thing also exist, then I do not think that they can resemble a process of flux as we are now supposing. Plato believed that long before our bodies ever existed, our souls existed and inhabited heaven, where they became directly acquainted with the forms themselves. Real knowledge to him was knowledge of the forms, but knowledge of the forms cannot be gained through sensory experience because the forms are not in the physical world. Therefore, our real knowledge of the forms must be the memory of our initial acquaintances with the forms in heaven. Therefore, what we seem to learn is in fact just remembering. I don't buy that whole argument, but I do accept the notion that when we use a word, we have an understanding of the essence of that word, such as blue, which isn't a physical, tangible thing. It's the form. It's what is blue? Well, the form of blue is what blue actually is. Everything else is just a reference of it, or a often referred to as an imperfect version of the true form. And this was more applicable to things like love and truth and beauty and these things rather than blue or chair or whatever. The point here is that for everything we think we know, there is a form of that. Say, for instance, justice. We strive, when we strive for justice, we are striving for an unattainable. But the unattainable is what gives us the direction to strive. So when we're striving for justice, we're striving for perfect justice. We can never get there. We can only do the best we can. Sometimes we don't even do that, but that's a different story. The whole point here is that Plato brought us the forms, the concept of forms, and that is that the forms do exist, but not tangibly where I can hold on to it and give it to you, because they're quite often, most of the time, it's a concept. In the beginning, I mean, it's a concept, and the form is the perfection of the concept. So blue, while we use it as a color, it's also a concept. We know what blue is, okay, and because the form of blue exists that we can reference. Now, this is very deep philosophical stuff. Someone who argued similarly was Carl Jung, when he argued that there is a shared subconscious that we all have subconsciously as being part of the human species. There are things that we share, and I would suggest that forms are along that line. I don't want to spend too much time on forms. I just want you to know, but you can read the Wikipedia page, or you can read Plato's original, however you want to do it, and come to an understanding of what forms are and what a form is. A form is the ideal or perfect version of a concept or an idea. Okay, so moving on. Let's get now. How does this relate to God? Well, let's go to this one. God. Now, I was raised a Christian. Grew up in a Christian household. Went to a Methodist Christian church. And I learned about, in Sunday school, I learned about Abraham and Moses, Adam and Eve, Abraham, Moses, the great heroes, David, the story of David and Goliath, the story of Samson and Delilah. I learned these as a child, learned these stories, and they were, a lot of them were moral stories, and a lot of them were presented as historical reference points. Specifically, Abraham and Moses were historical points, whereas the story of Samson and Delilah would have been more of a moral story about faith in God. But the point here is that there are three Abrahamic religions which share a common God. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all accept the tradition of the God that revealed himself to Abraham, and then later to Moses. What you have to understand about Moses is that it's pretty much there are a lot of things that scholars do and don't agree on about the history of the Bible, historical figures of the Bible. Aaron, Moses' brother, was the scribe. He was the guy who wrote stuff down. Similarly, he is believed to have been the mouthpiece of Moses, so that when Moses would be inspired or taught by God, this would be related to the people through his brother Aaron. His brother Aaron being a more eloquent speaker. That's just one perspective on this. Anyway, So where we go next then? Okay, just to let's knock some things out here. Abraham had two known spousal units, we'll call them. His first wife, Sarai, originally renamed to Sarah because she was barren and wasn't able to provide children. And because she, as Sarai, she was barren and unable to bear children, or believed to be, and so she allowed one of an Egyptian slave servant of hers to lie with Abraham, and she, her servant Hagar, gave birth to Abraham's first son. Now, this is going to raise a question of firstborn son, because by law, Hagar was not his wife, and therefore Ishmael, the firstborn son, was born out of wedlock, and so was not a legitimate heir. 14 years later, Sarah, after changing her name from Sarai to Sarah, gave birth to another son, Isaac. And so this is about Abraham, and there's the web page on that, and then there's the web page on Hagar, and Hagar is the matriarch of Islam, whereas Sarah is the matriarch of Judaism and the Christian, the New Testament of that would reference Sarah as the matriarch. But Christianity also comes as the fulfillment of the Old and the beginning of the New Testament, and so it becomes irrelevant who inherited Adam's, because Jesus becomes the progenitor of God's people in faith. Now you have to understand that there's a couple thousand years between the time of Moses and the time of Muhammad. Moses being the last, Moses and his brother Aaron being the prior to them, most of Judaic religious material was in the form of narratives, spoken oral history, because Aaron was the scribe who ended up writing down all the stuff while they were wandering in the wilderness and whatnot. So the history of the stories prior to Moses are going to all be oral tradition narratives, and those after will be things that were documented by scribes and written down. You kind of have to understand that, but it also brings about where God is given, where God gives its name to Moses, and Moses is the person to whom God reveals his name, and that happens when Moses goes up on the mount and speaks to the burning bush, speaks to him. I'm not going to go off into side conspiracy theories about what the bush was and how it might have been causing him to trip or anything like that. We'll just move on to the names of God, where we learn and God in the Abrahamic religions. I want to get to there's a whole bunch of names of God in the Bible and in biblical text. But see, like in Judaism, you've got the Tetragrammaton, which begins it, which is YHWH, and then Christianity has come to accept Yahweh, Jehovah. Mormonism, slightly different, Heavenly Father, Jehovah's Witnesses, so on and so forth. But it all stems from the Tetragrammaton in the Tetragrammaton. The Tetragrammaton is 4 Jewish characters, which translate to English roughly as YHWH. It's 4 characters. Now, what you need to understand about Hebrew is that in Hebrew, each letter of the alphabet is not just a guide to pronunciation of words, they are words. And the Hebrew language is a system of creating compound words out of smaller words. So the Hebrew alphabet is a list of, we'll call them basic concepts, and then you combine them to create a more complex concept. And this is not a real example. I'm just going to make this up. But if you have, if you want to describe swimming, it would involve specifically you swimming. You're going to have the I identifier, and then you're going to have the movement identifier, and the water identifier, or whatever these characters from the Hebrew alphabet which would make then a series of these letters that identify the act of swimming. It's not a really good example, but it gets the point across that the Hebrew alphabet is more than just phonetic guide to pronunciation, as with the English alphabet. For the English alphabet, every letter is a sound that, and when combined in certain patterns, create a word. Well, in Hebrew, each letter can be by itself a word. And so when we get to the Tetragrammaton here, the four characters that are the name of God, this comes from Exodus 3:14, where Moses is speaking, God is speaking to Moses through the burning bush, and telling him to go to be the leader of the Hebrew people. Moses is reluctant, to say the least. God is telling him to go be their leader, which is, huge. huge. Go and lead these people when he is not. In the story, he was not one of them. He was raised as an Egyptian, adopted son of the Pharaoh, and so he was going to have to. God told him to go and tell the Hebrew people that he comes on behalf of the God of Abraham. Well, Moses, justifiably, has some uncertainty about this, and asks, if I say I go to these people and I tell them that the God of Abraham has sent me to lead you, and they turn and ask me what is his name, what am I to tell them? And so this is when God gives his name, and and it is YHWH. And the four, let's get over to that. I'll come back. I'll come back to that. This is the four words. This is YHWH. Now notice that translations of this into other languages, like English, add words in the same way that in order to make YHWH pronounce, because when you say what is the name of God, it's like, well, it's Bob, you know what I mean? Well, Bob is not really, the name of God is not one word, it's four words. It's YHWH, and it is not, it was never a single pronounced word. But in order to make it so, extra letters were added to, and here it is, the form Yahweh, and this is not Platonic form. This is just the form, the modern, how it exists in text. Yahweh is now accepted almost universally. That is, this A added and this E added, where the YHWH were the original four characters, in order to make these four individual words into a single pronounceable word unit, Yahweh. But that then takes away from the fact that there are four individual words with individual meanings. By making this word Yahweh and not giving it an explanation of what the individual characters meant, it takes away from what the name of God is. And later on, you get doctrines that forbid the speaking of this word, which isn't the name of God. It's a construct. It's a fabricated construct from the original four characters. Okay, so the four characters, YHWH, and here's some examples of how it has been translated. I am who I am. I will become what I choose to become. I am what I am. I will be what I will be. I create whatever I create. I am the existing one. The traditional English translation within Judaism favors I will be what I will be, because there is no present tense of the verb to be in the Hebrew language. That is, they don't have an am. They don't have I am. It's that what their the H in here is more akin to the English word being, as in the essence of what to be is. And this takes me to my clarification of the difference between existence and being. existence is, uh, this lighter exists. Okay, it exists, but it has no being. It has no. It can't be anything. It just is. It just exists as a lighter. It has no inner essence of assertable amness. I am. Like you can say, I am hungry, or I am thirsty, or I am angry, or I am a male human, or the essence of being something doesn't exist in this lighter. This lighter simply exists. Humans, on the other hand, have an essence of being, which is why we call them human beings. Well, that's what this H is being. And so to translate these four Jewish characters, it would not be these 5-word, 6-word, 7, 8-word, because it's only 4 words. And it's 4 very basic words, because these, as I said, the Hebrew alphabet is comprised of characters which represent basic thought concepts, the most basic of thought. If you want to create a more complex thing, you use several of them to create a more complex idea. So these things like I am the existing one, but you can't really get there from YHWH without going through a whole lot of jumping through interpretational hoops. The words themselves are, the Y character is the first person proper, I. The H is this notion of it's some form of the word to be, which in Hebrew there is no present tense of this. It's just it's the concept of being. And so we'll say that it's being, I being. The W is literally that, as in that thing, that. So translating this literally from Hebrew to English, it is I being that being. Which can take us to close to one of these. It doesn't list it here, but one of the formulations. See, when they translate it to English, they try to make it so that it is somewhat colloquial, as in any common person can understand this, and so they will say something like, I am that which I am, which is kind of a circular argument. No, I think it's something more specific than that. I think God, in this instance of Judaic history narrative, the 4 characters are meant to be exactly as they are. I being that being. Because in the very next verses, he goes on to say, so you tell them, and if we change it to if we make the change to I am, as in I am what I am, these other things, I will be what if we change it to I am that am, which is very similar. It's just we have the present tense. We have the present tense version of being, which is not inaccurate. Okay, it makes it easier then to go to the English translation of just I being, which is I am. But in the very next verses, God says, "So you tell them, I am has sent you." Whereas, and then they do this, and that it is done this way because if you say I being, it doesn't have the same assertive power in English that I am has, because part of what God is, by this identifying definition here, is identifying the name of God, one aspect of what God is the power of assertion. Not merely existing, but existing as being, which can assert. So am, therefore, is, you say, I am that am, I am that am, I am that am. That am from I am, then you get I am or am. Am is God. Am, the essence of assertable being, is what God is. I can understand this, and I can accept that exists. Assertable being does exist, because later in the Psalms we get Psalm. Where was that? Psalm 82:6. God says, I have said you are gods. Well, God is being. And to say you are beings, you are ams. You are all individual ams. You are all gods. So God's children, gods, those who understand what God is, are children of that. Because once you understand that is the power of God, then it becomes an undeniable thing. Once you understand that that's the power of God, the ability to assert is the power of God. Now, this takes us to the responsibilities of this knowledge. And so let's go to the 10 Commandments, and specifically this commandment. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Whereas the name of the Lord is I being that being, or I am. God is I am. God is assertion. Do not, and in vain doesn't mean there's an alternative definition of in vain, which most people actually use, and that would be when your vehicle gets stuck in the mud, and it's stuck, and you're spinning your wheels. You're spinning your wheels in vain, meaning it's not getting anywhere. Whereas in this context, we're talking about vanity, and that is self, that song, You're So Vain, you know what I mean? It's self adoration of a sort, I guess. While yes, you want to adore God, God is not, you are not God. You're a God. You're a being, but you are not being, because being is a form of the imperfect version that you are. And according to then Christian tradition, Jesus was God with us. Jesus was the embodiment of the form of being. And so this here, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord God in vain, it actually adds, there's more to it. It says, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. That means if you are vain and you assert yourself for the sake of vanity, let's say you have been tasked with creating a public performance of some sort, and you bill yourself as the headliner or star because you are that full of yourself. That's vanity. That's asserting yourself, calling upon the name of Lord thy God in vain. And God's not very forgiving of that. If you're vain, self-absorbed, vain. There's a Greek Narcissus. The story of Narcissus is a story of vanity. God's not forgiving of us. God, as in all the other gods, all the other beings, are kind of intolerant of people who are vain. So don't take the name of the Lord God in vain. Unless you are actually the chosen Son of God, Jesus, you probably shouldn't call upon God's name, assert yourself for the sake of vanity, self adoration, self adulation. Just a side story to help you better understand the calling upon the name of God, asserting oneself. The story of David and Goliath. There's a lot of it. I pulled it up and I read this whole thing and all the various interpretations who was Goliath and what the circumstances were around which the story, who was David. Well, there's a whole lot of doubt about the quote unquote truth of this story. But what I also want to tell you is that these are part of the similar but far more robust and detailed, similar to Aesop's fables, where you have a circumstance to be overcome and there's a moral lesson to it. Well, this is a moral story about in its most rudimentary, simplistic interpretation, it's a moral story about the underdog, the giant warrior, and the young shepherd boy and his staff and sling who defeats him. So it doesn't really matter whether or not it was David, who was a what is it, relative nephew of or something, Saul, or seventh son, maybe. He was low. He wasn't firstborn. He was like the seventh of several children. And so the whole point here was to creating the underdog, the least likely, because, the firstborn son would have been the one called upon to go, to go and do this work. But even Saul himself would not go out and fight this guy, Goliath, this great big giant of a warrior. But this young lad stepped up and answered the question, who here is capable of defeating me? And this young shepherd boy, not so much in word, but in deed, said, I am. I am. He called upon the name of God. Goliath asked, who here is capable of defeating me? And David stepped up and by deed said, I am. It was an assertion of the name of God. All of the Bible stories prior to Moses, as I said, were oral tradition. And the creation story was an oral tradition. And there are actually multiple versions of it, chapters of it that have been left out, and so on and so forth in the modern biblical canon. But they were oral tradition. Tell this story to explain the beginning, the Genesis story, the story of the Garden of Eden, the story of creation of the world and all that. These were oral traditions to explain the world, explain human existence. I do not know how the universe came into being, or excuse me, I do not know how the universe came into existence. What I do know is that without being, without the essence of being, which exists in beings, self-aware, assertable entities, such as humans and animals. I don't know about plants, but I do know that animals can assert themselves. Just as humans can assert themselves. The power of assertion is what makes the universe whole, what makes a person whole. Without being, simply existing has no meaning, because there is no being for it to have meaning to. So being is what gives life meaning. So being is the maker of the world. Not necessarily the creator, but the maker, that which makes complete, makes whole. Because without being, without self-awareness that you can assert being, Without that, the things that exist have no meaning. So being, God, makes the universe. Not necessarily creates it, but makes it, as in makes it whole. You're making if you're making something, it can be just a blob of clay until you do this, and then it's that. Once you do that, it's that. Well, you can have living organisms, bacteria and whatnot, but until you add the ability to assert, to make decisions and assert, you don't have being. Once you have being, that is when it becomes more than simple existence. That is what God is. God is maker, as in makes whole. Now, I said that if I were to define God, I would define God as the form of being. So God would then be both, because God said, you are gods, beings, you are beings, you are little lambs, but you are not the am, which is what God is. God is the form of it, the perfect form that we all aspire to be like in some way, or we should all aspire to be like. Along with, well, beside this, there is an Asian, Oriental, Asian. I don't want to be derogatory with my words. I'm just trying to get the point across. Is that, talking East Asia, China, and surrounding Taoism embraces this same concept from a different Oriental and Asian philosophies and religions present themselves differently than Western European religions and philosophies. But Taoism is one that I found very fascinating when I was studying various religions at college. Taoism is a philosophy of there being a true way that only Tao literally translates as way or path. The way, the path. The way is more, the path would be a physical thing, trodden on the ground, clearly identified for you. The way is not so much. If you use the word the way as the translation of the Tao, then you get the ambiguous. You don't know. You can know the way, but you cannot. Well, actually, you can't. You can't know the true way. You can only know what it's like, and you can discuss it. You can talk around it, and you can describe it, but you can never actually state what the true way is. Well, the way, what do you mean by the way? It's the way of being. So it is about being. The true way of being, an imperfect mortal human can never know. They can only aspire to be like it. They can only aspire to a way that is like the true way, in the same way that a human is not God, but is a God, an imperfect version, aspiring to be like the form of God. So Taoism is a monotheistic philosophy. Uh, I want to include Islam here briefly with re-emphasizing that the story of, you can read about this in the Bible if you care to. I'm going to reiterate the story here, paraphrased in a nutshell. Abram married Sarai, and Abram meant the father of a great nation or something like that. And I don't remember what Sarai meant, but later, because they had been married many, many years and had not had children, God instructed Abram to change his name to Abraham, father of the multitudes. And Sarai, around the same time, offered up her servant girl, Hagar, to I'm going to see how forgiving YouTube is, because Facebook was not. See if you got a bunch of dead space. While I wasn't streaming. That was my PC. Because I have no idea if I'm still streaming. I actually rebooted my computer, and when I came back it said live now, so we're going to find out. And I'm going to keep talking until such time as I find out. And it says I'm live for an hour and 5 minutes, so hopefully you're getting this too. And I'll close this up and then edit it before posting it. Yeah, how about that? I've already had 5 playbacks. That's pretty interesting. I'm going to close this with a comment in the chat, which comes from just my own self, sort of. Something that I learned about being and calling upon the name of the Lord, and that is that there's something that goes hand in hand with being. 2 things. One is self-determination. God, the power of assertion, is what gives an individual self-determination. But God, the power of assertion, is also what implies the mandate of personal accountability. You need to be accountable for your assertions, which then there goes to the don't call upon them. Was that close to finishing? I don't know what all I got in the first before my computer crashed, but I will edit this as soon as I'm done into a more completed video and call it that. Call that my episode. 1 hour, a little over an hour. I'm going to type this in here.